Today's lecture coincides with what in the syllabus says class number 30, and essentially we're finishing up some of the reading. There was no reading for today's class. The last reading was finishing up the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible material on Revelation from class 29, and our notes. We did not finish going through that material, so we'll do that at this time. So our first note has to do with Revelation chapter 12. How is the devil described in Revelation chapter 12? Throughout the scriptures there are references to the devil, sometimes referred to specifically in that way. Sometimes the devil is referred to as Satan or the deceiver or in a variety of other ways. But in chapter 12 he is described somewhat vividly and in kind of a picturesque story or drama, or almost kind of like a scene from an adventure movie. And so I'd like to go ahead and read Revelation chapter 12, and then we'll come up with a sentence that answers the question, how is the devil described in Revelation chapter 12? C.S. Lewis has said that in some of his writings, C.S. Lewis is come to be known in our day and time as a great writer within the realm of Christianity, but his actual academic work, his doctorate, and that is in literature. But he is a great writer, but also has come to be known as a great theologian. And he said there's two mistakes you can make with regard to your attitude toward the devil. One is just to believe that he doesn't exist, and the other is to be obsessed with a fear of him, or focus on him, or attention on him. And I think that I think those have been two mistakes that have been common in Christendom. But the wiser course of action would be to just have a biblical understanding of the devil, because the New Testament is really our primary source concerning the devil from the Judeo-Christian standpoint. So let's go ahead and take a look at Revelation chapter 12. Yeah, just starting at verse 1. Because it is it plays out like a scene from a drama, so we'll go ahead and just kind of read straight through. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Notice that these are called signs, and signs are things that point to other things, so they're clearly symbolic, and yet we're going to see when we identify who this woman is, or in a sense that there are some literal connections in history. But verse 3 says, another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. So before we go on to verse 7, at this point we can identify that the child and the woman both have positive connotations, that they are associated with God and the kingdom of God. And the dragon is associated with evil because he is wanting to devour the child when the child is born, and to devour the child, to destroy or to kill the child. And the child, we've already said, is associated with God and goodness. 1,260 days is 3.5 years. Throughout Revelation, 7 years is oftentimes a portrayal of a complete time period, and so half of that would be 3.5 years, perhaps a literal 3.5 years, or perhaps a statement saying, not a complete time period, but for a temporary interval of time. Starting with verse 7, continuing on, we've got this, the child was born, and the child is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and the child is caught up to God and to his throne, and the woman is also able to flee to the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, where she is to be nourished for 3.5 years. Verse 7, now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. So here we have a war in heaven, and the leaders, it appear, are Michael and the dragon on the opposite sides. Two angels, we've mentioned this semester, are specifically named in the New Testament, and that is all. Many angels are described and talked about, but only two have their names recorded that I can remember from what I have seen and read. Michael and Gabriel. And so here, again, Michael is associated with being an angel that's faithful to God, not like the devil, who most scholars feel like was an angel and rebelled. And there was a reference in Revelation chapter 12 that we just read, that with his tail, the dragon swept 1/3 of the stars out of heaven. And some think that when Satan or the devil rebelled against God and was cast out of heaven, that 1/3 of the angels rebelled with him, and they are the demons that are described later throughout the New Testament. And so the dragon and his angels fought back. Verse 8 says, but he, the dragon, was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. So no question now that, as we said in the first 7 verses, the dragon is associated with evil. Here he's specifically identified as the devil and Satan, or sometimes I had said he's also called the deceiver of the whole world. That's mentioned. And the accuser is the other name that, if you do a study throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament as well on the devil, the word accuser will come up, because he accuses people as if before God he's like a corrupt lawyer who's trying to, wanting people to be convicted. And the courtroom scene has the devil trying to convict people, but Christ being our defense attorney who says everything you're saying that's true is true about these people. They deserve death. However, their penalty has been paid in full. Okay, so the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death. So far the scene has had to do with the dragon and the woman who is giving birth to the child. And of course, the woman you could say is Mary, perhaps. Because she has the crown of 12 stars on her head. Some might say that the woman is maybe Israel. She's a representation of the nation of Israel with all 12 tribes, and how Christianity obviously came from Judaism. But nonetheless, in addition to these huge figures in this drama, the dragon and the woman and the child, Then there is also now human beings, and it talks about those that have conquered this accuser, this dragon, the devil or Satan, that they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they love not their lives even unto death. And so again, very consistent themes, emphasis on the blood of the Lamb because of the sacrifice of Christ, by which their sins were paid for, their penalty was paid, and the word of their testimony, their claim to fame is not their goodness or their righteousness or their deeds, but it's their testimony that Christ has risen from the dead and that Jesus is Lord. Would be common ways perhaps of describing the testimony of the saints, and that they persevered under great difficulties like the persecution that we've talked about throughout the New Testament. They loved not their lives even unto death. They loved God more than they loved their own life, and many Christians from that time and up until today still are losing their lives because of the testimony of Jesus Christ. So verse 12 says, "Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them, but woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child." So at this point, it seems like a drama that's describing a greater period of history than merely, Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus, but looking at all of history. And so just as the woman prior to the birth of Christ could be seen of as Israel, after the birth of Christ, the woman could be thought of as the church. And so he said, and when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The serpent poured out water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from its mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus, and he stood on the sand of the sea. So again, it's a very dramatic passage. It's a passage that has a lot of theological truth, and yet instead of just maybe stating it in very bland, ordinary terms, that there is going to be conflict between good and evil, it describes it in very adventurous and imaginative, not using the word imaginative in terms of like being made up or false, but being imaginative in terms of very creative and interesting and appealing to the mind's eye. So the question was, how is the devil described in Revelation chapter 12? Quite simply, the devil is described as a dragon who wants to devour Christ and make war against Christians. The devil is described in Revelation chapter 12 as a dragon who wants to devour Christ and make war against Christians. Okay, Revelation chapter 12, obviously. Next question. What one verse summarizes well the basic content of the whole book of Revelation? What one verse summarizes well the basic content of the whole book of Revelation? We've already seen that Revelation is a book that is written to Christians during a time of great difficulty and persecution. the book of Revelation had a specific purpose for those believers in the first century who were enduring difficulties and suffering, many losing their lives because of their testimony of Christ. And so it was a call for them to endure and to have perseverance. I'm going to share a couple verses with you that are not the answer to this question, but they kind of point to some of the reason, especially Revelation was written for the original hearers, not perhaps for those throughout history. If the New Testament was inspired by God, then from that perspective, the New Testament has purposes for generations and generations, right up until today and up until the end of history. But it also had purpose for the very first before the canon was even pulled together. The first people that were able to get this message, we assume that perhaps John wrote on a scroll, and that scroll was somehow delivered from the prison island of Patmos onto the land and started being taken to these 7 churches that were described very early in the first 2 or 3 chapters of Revelation, to Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamum and Philadelphia, and those cities that were in that little circuit on the mainland close to the island of Patmos. But I read this morning, in fact, that there are 2 different times in chapter 13 verse 10 and in chapter 14 verse 12, there's these references that says this is a call for the endurance of the saints. And so John describes that there's going to be suffering, that they're suffering right now, and John says that it's not going to get, for many people it's not going to get easier. It's not going to be over in a few days, and then after that everything's going to be easy for the rest of Christendom. He says that there's going to be a lot of suffering because the forces of evil will continue to be at work. The enemy, the dragon that we read about in chapter 12, will continue to try to make war against the offspring of the woman, the other Christians, or those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus as it was described. And so he says there's going to be continual conflict between good and evil. And so that it will be difficult, and that some will continue to lose their lives even, and to certainly suffer as a result of holding firm to the testimony of Christ. And yet, those I don't believe are really the single verses that summarize the whole content of the book of Revelation. For that, I would go to Revelation chapter 17, verse 14. Again, there's a lot of very picturesque language describing the forces of evil. There's false prophets and dragons and beasts and they do sometimes miraculous signs. The beasts, the first beast described in Revelation is killed, and then he comes back to life, and there's another beast that makes an image of the first beast, and it gives the image the ability to speak, and so again it's kind of spectacular language. It really sticks in people's minds normally when they read it. And there's a lot of miracles that even the beasts and the dragon and do. And it is a reminder that miracles are not always an indication that they are a source of goodness. Miracles are an indication that there is a realm beyond the physical realm that has power. And so obviously Jesus did a lot of miracles, but in Revelation we read that there are sometimes the false prophets and the forces of evil also do some miracles. So Revelation kind of has as a sub-theme the warning that not everyone who does a miracle is necessarily good. They could be part of the deceiver, but they do have power outside of above and beyond the realm of the physical and the natural and the things that we can learn about and understand from the scientific method and so forth. So So that's another sub-theme, but in Revelation 17:14, I think we have a verse that summarizes the whole book, because it starts by saying, Revelation 17 verse 14, they will make war on the Lamb. And we've already seen that. There's these beasts and dragons, and then the beasts have sometimes 10 horns. We saw the dragon in Revelation 12 had 10 horns, and these 10 horns are described as being 10 different kings and rulers and so forth. And so there's all these forces of evil and described in a variety of very powerful and life-threatening ways. And verse 14 says they will make war on the Lamb. So that describes a lot of what we've read about in Revelation. The conflict between good and evil, the conflict between the dragon and the child, or as we saw him described very early on in the book of Revelation as a lamb who was slain. And we've talked about that language a lot as the great sacrifice. But the next phrase after they will make war on the Lamb, that says, and the Lamb will conquer them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings. This is more familiar language to us in terms of Lord of lords and King of kings, describing God. Sometimes these phrases are used to describe God the Father, but here they're used to describe the Lamb. And that's one of the evidences of Scripture of the deity of Christ, that the same phrases that describe the Father describe the Son many times. And so they will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And so this verse gives us a summary that the great conflict between good and evil, but it also tells us that the Lamb will ultimately be victorious. And that is the message of Revelation. Some have said we can, if you're a follower of Christ, a New Testament, a Christian in the New Testament sense, you can summarize Revelation in 2 words: we win. And I think that is an accurate understanding of Revelation, even though it's obviously quite simplistic and concise. And yet, this verse has a third phrase that I think is especially encouraging, would have been especially encouraging to the first recipients of this, who were going through oftentimes struggle and hardships and sufferings. Not only does it describe the conflict, the war against the Lamb, but and the ultimate victory of the Lamb, but it says the last phrase, it says, and those with him are called, chosen, and faithful. So it's a reminder that not only is the Lamb ultimately the victor, the conqueror, but that he's not all alone. He's not the last surviving entity of goodness. Because those who this reminds us of the other descriptions throughout Revelation of those who, were faithful and held to the testimony of Jesus. Here it says, those with him are called, chosen, and faithful, describing his followers and not merely describing his own victory over evil alone. So, Revelation 17:14. Is one good verse that within the span of one verse summarizes the basic content very well of the whole book of Revelation. Next question. It's the flip side of verse 17 that Jesus will conquer. They will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will conquer them or overcome them, according to Revelation 17:14. But the flip side is that, what is the final fate of evil, according to the book of Revelation? What is the final fate of evil? Is the conflict between good and evil an eternal conflict? Will it go on forever and ever? That's a similar question, kind of a corollary, but the question as I have it in my notes is, what is the final fate of evil according to the book of Revelation? And the verses to write down for that are Revelation chapter 20, verses 7 through 15. Revelation describes a 1,000-year reign and of Christ on the earth, and then this passage deals with doesn't introduce that. It kind of touches on it after it's already been introduced. But beginning of verse 7, we read in Revelation chapter 20, "And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are on the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the seas. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. From his presence earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one of them according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. That is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." So the conflict is not an eternal conflict. There is an end to the conflict, a time when the accuser, the devil, will be put in a place of punishment forever and ever, and death, even death and Hades, death and hell are portrayed as being cast into that place. And then there is a time of judgment at the end. So even as the Old Testament described a time of ultimate judgment, the New Testament ends with a book that describes very vividly a time of judgment. And yet, that's not how the book of Revelation ends there. It's close to the end, but there's one more chapter that we'll take some notes on. Matt?
How would, because some denominations say that hell doesn't exist when they read the New Testament, that there's no evidence for hell. Would this be a passage that would kind of point towards the existence of eternal hell?
Yeah, there certainly are some Christian denominations that believe that when people die, they just cease to exist. That I think they believe in heaven for those that are, Christians, but they don't believe in a hell. They believe that, that is the punishment of not accepting God's forgiveness, is just ceasing to exist. And I think that that's based a little bit more on just, a line of logic saying, God would surely not send anyone to a place of eternal punishment. But nonetheless, that's as you say, this and other passages throughout the New Testament would indicate that there is a place of eternal suffering, and that it's not just a lack of consciousness, that it's suffering. And so
this passage would be an indication. Like, this would be a good passage to say.
Yeah, I do. I think that it would be, and I think there's others, quite a few others as well in the Gospels, and here. Okay. Let's pause for a moment before we hit our last few questions in the second half of the lecture.